By default, the children of flexboxes and grids are placed right up against each other with no breathing room. You can see that here in my example. We have a grid, there's no space between the cells, and we have a flexible box or a flex box, and there's no space between each of the flex items. This makes sense. From a layout perspective, you often want a tight grid or a tight flex box, and then each of the items can then position themselves. However, there are also times when you need space between these items, either to visually separate them or to meet a specific layout or design goal, or to just separate content in a layout. When CSS Grid was first introduced, it came with a new property called Grid Gap that added gaps or gutters between the cells inside the grid. You could then set a column gap or a row gap or both using this property. Let me show you how that works. So I can go into my grid here and say Grid Gap, and then I'll set one value. So I'll set it to 1 rem. If I set just one value, then the value is applied both to the rows and to the columns. So we get 1 m on the rows here and 1 m between each column. If I set two values, so 1 rem and 2 rem, and save, you'll see the first value then applies to the rows here, and the second value applies to the columns. But if I hover my mouse over this item here in VS Code, it says, this property is obsolete, avoid using it. That's because as we started using both grid and flex, users of Flexbox started asking the question, why can't we have gutters or gaps in Flexboxes? Why is it only applied to grid? If you've ever used Flexbox, you know that to create a faux gap, you have to do math to figure out how big each of the boxes should be and then add the space in between. It doesn't really work all that well. As a result, the CSS working group expanded the gap principle to also include Flexbox. And now we have a new property that's just called gap. It works the exact same way, so I can say here 2 rem and 1 rem just to reverse it and save. And you'll see it works the same way in grid. The first value is the value for the rows, the second value is the value for the columns, and if you set just one value, it applies to both. But we can now use the same rule for flexible boxes as well. So if we say display flex, we can say gap and 1 rem, and watch the box down here, save it, and now we have gaps between the boxes as well. And the cool thing is, this property doesn't change the size of the grid or the flexible box. Instead, it reduces the size of the items inside to add a consistent gap between items. Now, in grid, we've always had this, so it's not a surprise. But for Flexbox, this is a major improvement because, like I said, before we had to size each of the items inside the Flexbox and then do the math of what should each of these items size be if we have these gaps, and then what if we accidentally added an additional one at the end, then the size would be off and we would have to do all this math. That's no longer necessary. The gap property works both on grid and flex and will always add gaps between the items by reducing the size of each items, and you then have complete control and you can have consistency across your flexible boxes and your grids.